So guys, welcome to another video. I think we have an interesting discussion today. We're going to have a look at all the sales arguments for one format versus another format, and we're going to try and make a bit of sense out of all these arguments. And then I'm going to show you how to optimize your camera, how to optimize the sensor, and what you should know to optimize the sensor. We are going to keep it really simple. I'm going to end with a short edit of a low light image I took in the week. So I'd like you to have a look at this article. I'll put the link in the description below. If you haven't been to my blog, there's lots of information and I believe quite interesting articles to study. These images I took in Germany 2 or 3 weeks ago. Had lots of fun, and I'm asking you also to have a look at the pictures and guess which lens I used. Tip, you will find the answer in the article. So if you page down, you will see this paragraph here, the next one, and the next one basically explains the different cameras and what it means to have a higher efficiency for your sensor or to optimize the sensor, even ETTR. You will have a better understanding for that if you take your time, read it and reread it, and really get to understand what I'm saying there. Then this illustration here is actually quite an interesting illustration. It came about, I think last year sometime. I was spending some time on the DP review forum, the Micro Four Thirds forum, and there was a guy there who was quite knowledgeable, and he was talking a lot about sensor saturation and SNR, and I was always waiting for him to get to the point. But he would talk about these things and he would, sort of throw them out there, but he would never make the link to why he's talking about these aspects of the image sensor. In other words, he was sort of showing that he knows, he understands, but he wouldn't get to the point where the listener or the reader would really understand what he's talking about. I always found that interesting. Why would he do that? And then I was talking to AI a while back, and AI is a very interesting experience, and I guess all you guys are more familiar, most probably, than I am with AI. But what I find interesting is if you go and ask and you say, listen, I want to buy a camera, and people tell me the full frame camera is the better one, and yes, I'd like to have a good camera, then I would immediately say, wow, that's a good decision. Which brand would you prefer? Then I can help you finding the best full frame camera for you. And if you then turn around and you ask AI, I say, yeah, but I also really like the size and weight benefit of the Micro Four Thirds. And there's this crazy guy that says there's not much of a difference. Yeah, good point. Micro Four Thirds are very good cameras, but remember, the full frame captures more light. So then he would pivot back to the full frame story. And then if you challenge him on the full frame, on the capture more light statement, then AI will start backing off and become more theoretical, which is a very interesting scenario when AI sort of realized, but the person on the other side has some knowledge and I need to be more correct, if you may. And then you can learn a lot. Where I learned the most is to look at the links he posts from where he gets the information from. So in one of his arguments, or its arguments, I saw again the Micro Four Thirds sensor is 4 times smaller than the full frame sensor, and the more light sort of storyline, and he was giving he was making calculations about the area, the total area of the full frame sensor versus the small sensor in Micro Four Thirds. And I let him do, and I let him go. And then at the end I said, but shouldn't we look at pixels, because pixels captures photons? And then same thing. Yeah, you're right. Good point. Thank you for reminding me. And then you go through the same thing again, and then we get to the end where the same light intensity exposes all sensor sizes. The focal length is covering the full sensor for each sensor size, and the same scene information is transferred to each of the different sensor sizes with the same light intensity. That's why the exposure values for my Micro Four Thirds camera is really the same as the exposure values on a full frame camera. Now this illustration here shows the differences, and it also explains why I talk about the two-stop Micro Four Thirds advantage. And there's a reason for doing that, because the focus today, and I call it a commercial focus, is more on portrait photography and a background blur. So a full frame person will say you need to use f1.4 to get the same background blur as what I get on an f2.8. And this goes back to the so-called equivalence. Now, equivalence for me is another crazy, and it's a little crazy because I never think of equivalence when I do photography. I think of my 12mm f2 compact lens, or I think of the awesome 12-45 f4 lens, or the 70-300 or the 12-200 lens. I never think in terms of full frame focal length. But so we have to think equivalent sometimes, and it is basically explained here with the f2.8 versus f1.4. So the focus really here is shallow depth of field and the benefits of that, and Micro Four Thirds is not really the right camera for that. It also applies to focal length, and that is why 42mm is 84 in full frame, and it's basically the sensor size, the diagonal of the image circle that has to be projected onto the sensor. But this is with a focus on this side of the scale, a shallow depth of field versus a deeper depth of field. It's quite important. Think a little bit about this scenario here. So from this point here, we are really looking for a shallow depth of field, and on this side we are looking for a deeper depth of field. So we want a deeper depth of field for cityscapes or landscapes, hiking, nature, and wildlife microphotography. It's difficult for us on this side, it's difficult for the full frame person on that side. If you think in terms of, and I'm a little sarcastic here, if you think in terms of full frame common sense, then one could say, yeah, for a shallow depth of field is perfect for iPhone full frame or APC cameras. The reason I say iPhone is because iPhones or mobile phones doesn't have a good reach like for wildlife photography, so it fits perfect in this area here. If you need cityscapes, hiking, nature, or wildlife macro photography where a deeper depth of field and reach is important, then you will look more for computational photography and Micro Four Thirds cameras. It's just a perfect fit the more you think about it. Here on this side, the ISO is not so important because you typically have artificial light like LED panels to control the fourth exposure variable, and on this side ISO does become important. So why? Because I assume for this example here we're going to use a shutter speed of a 400th of a second. So if I want to maintain a constant shutter speed and I'm changing my aperture values to get the same depth of field, then I need to change the ISO at the same time. And this is now the first point where the full frame guy has a bit of a disadvantage because he now needs a higher ISO than the Micro Four Thirds person. The moment you have a higher ISO, you have a higher noise level in the image. Now remember, all image sensors has a noise floor, and I'll show it to you in a while. So this is now the first really significant advantage of Micro Four Thirds, where we have a lower aperture, which means a lower ISO, less noise, and more dynamic range. The higher we go up with the ISO, the lower the dynamic range goes. So any benefit that the full frame camera might have is typically lost with this two-stop difference here. And this is why I'm talking about a two-stop Micro Four Thirds advantage. It's on the aperture side, it's on the lens side, the size and weight, and it's on the image signal amplification or the ISO side. So let's look at another example. And this article is also important. You find a link to this article in the previous one. So if you go here, then you will see I've put a link here just below this nice monochrome image. Don't you think that's great? Just look at this image. So this is the Pen F or the OM3 or the EP7 monochrome function that you can use on your OM5 or EM1, 3 and many of the Olympus cameras. So this article has a lot of very interesting information. So we can start off with this and just a quick direction of light. Study this, I'm not going to go there. The exposure formula, also mentioned in the previous article. The 4 exposure variables I'm referring to is f-stop, aperture, shutter speed, ISO, and average scene luminance. Here you can see the scene luminance is reflected back onto the sensor. So we have a source, illumination, providing light that can be reflected, which is now reflected light or scene luminance. And interesting, we have a scene perspective or a luminance perspective here from the sensor. Study this and get familiar with that. So we control 4 variables for the correct exposure mix. Most people are only aware of these 3. They know that there's light outside, but they never think of it in terms of an exposure variable. Why an exposure variable? Because the light is changing. You know, the morning or late afternoon light is different from a midday light. Poor light conditions is different. So the average scene luminance are constantly changing, and you can use that to your advantage. So the next one I want to also go quickly is we do this a lot. This is the image signal path, the scene, the reflected light going through the lens, through the aperture shutter and exposing the sensor, and then exposure compensation, or in fact this dial here is representing the ISO, but you know, we can also call it the exposure compensation if we separate the 2 here. What is important here is 3 of the 4 exposure variables have a direct impact on how much I expose my sensor. That would be the shutter and the aperture and the average scene luminance. These 3 control how much light is reaching or exposing the sensor. Very important, because I can push my sensor to its optimum efficiency by exposing it optimally. This concept is so important. So by having more light on the sensor, I can have the sensor's efficiency optimum, or I can optimize the sensor's efficiency. It reminds me of the capture more light theory, because it's basically the same thing. What is interesting is the capture more light theory, the capture more light variable, is not included in the exposure formula. It's sort of on the side, and it's sort of doing a similar thing, but it's almost magically happening, and it's not a documented process. But if it was part of the exposure formula, then I would have accepted that, and then I would have believed, yeah, there might be a difference between the one and the other sensor. But we know that the same exposure settings give me the same exposure on different sensor sizes. So the concept of adding light to the sensor is important. Now let's take a quick example here. What if the ISO is changing? So if I want to add more light here, I could say I'm going to up my exposure compensation. In other words, I'm going to up my exposure by increasing the compensation. That means I'm adding more light to the sensor. But that's not always true. All that might happen is the ISO goes up. So if I really want to make sure I'm getting more light on the sensor, I need to fix the ISO. And then I know if I change the exposure compensation, then I'm adding more light to the sensor. Very important concept. The alternative is to work completely in manual mode. That means ISO and aperture shutter. So let's have a look at the most important concept of what we're talking about today, and that is the so-called photons to electrons graph. So on the horizontal axis we have photons, and on the vertical we have electrons, and we're looking at the conversion from photons to electrons. So this function of the sensor is a linear function. So if I have 10 photons here and I convert, I will get a number here. If this was 45 degrees, I will get 10 electrons. And if I go halfway and I have 5 photons, I will get 5 electrons. What is also important is the more light on the sensor effect is illustrated here. Every sensor has a noise floor. And there are basically two main components, the so-called short noise and the noise in the sensor. So the moment I switch on the sensor, there's already noise circulating in the sensor. You can learn more about the different noise, and here are a list of various descriptions. An important one to look at is a so-called AST point. It says the absolute sensitivity threshold. That means I need enough exposure on the sensor to cross this point here before I get a meaningful operation of the sensor. In other words, the sensor will then operate between these 2 points, the maximum so-called saturation level and the AST point. The difference is the dynamic range or maximum dynamic range of the sensor is determined between these 2 points. Another interesting point is I can have a smaller or bigger noise floor, and it normally depends on the type of sensor and the materials used to manufacture the sensor. So a very expensive, exclusive sensor will have a small noise floor, and a cheapie will probably have quite a bit of noise, being a bigger noise floor here. And the maximum S&R, signal to noise ratio, is typically between this point on the noise floor and the saturation capacity of the sensor. In other words, I will get the best picture quality if I can expose the sensor up to this point here. Now typically the camera will, the histogram will not be completely to the right. The maximum point might be at this point here, which means a little lower S&R, and people might complain about some noise in the blue sky. And then we can use ETTR, exposing to the right, which means we push the saturation to the full saturation capacity with more light on the sensor. The histogram moves all the way to the right, and then we know we have maximum dynamic range, and we have a fully saturated sensor and maximum S&R. So work on these concepts, try and work on this graph here. It took me quite some time to really appreciate it, and as you get more used to thinking of this, it really helps you to become much better with your camera. So all this information, is it really important? I think it is. You don't need to be an expert or an engineer on this information, but it really changes your photography, because all of a sudden you start thinking about light exposing the sensor. All different things that makes you more conscious of what you're doing with your camera. Do you need to apply ETTR every time? No, I use it very seldom, if never. But I'm very aware of what I'm doing whenever I'm photographing. So in general, I saw a huge improvement in my image quality based on the knowledge I gathered over the years. And that for me was the biggest advantage of learning more about the digital, I call it, imaging process. So again, this knowledge here, if you practice this and if you work on this sort of knowledge, you will find you become a way more capable photographer. Even in difficult situations, it will become much easier because you know where to look, you know what to think about, you know what is really happening, and that helps you to make good decisions on your exposure mix, or should I add more light to the scene? And all those things are answered through this basic set of knowledge here. So let's go to the example I want to show you. And this is a typical low light example. Now, a secret, I very, very seldom have noise problems. I can give all reasons for that, but I'm sometimes amazed at how little time I spend on noise or to try and remove noise. So here was a typical low light condition. You can see from the histogram on the top right here, the sensor was definitely saturated, so that's all good. Here on the low end, remember this is not saturation. This means only there was lots of data in this area here. There was less data in this area, less data, and you can see it here. So the shadows is quite a bit of data in the shadow areas. Then you have here on the highlight area, and in the midtones there's not that much information. So the way I would edit this, okay, before we also go there, now you can see I worked with a 2 times advantage of the sensor. So the length was the 1.5 or the 1.4 Leica 25mm. I used a f2.8 because I wanted a little depth of field, so I wanted to have at least a fair. Obviously, I won't get sharp right from there to here at f2.8, but at f2.8 I can get a much deeper depth of field than, for example, a full frame camera. That means I'm controlling the light, and it also means I can keep my ISO low, but I'm already on ISO 3200, which is on the high side for the OM5. I'm not that happy to always go there, but in a case like this I would, without thinking twice. I had no compensation, no exposure compensation, so I think this was the camera settings is okay, so I'm going to leave the exposure as is. I'm not going to change that. In fact, I might take it down 1 or 2 points, and the main reason for doing that is I want to highlight the lights here. I want to drop the sky a little. Now, one of the most important things that I do is I never think of recovering highlights or increasing shadows. I'm only playing with light. So my focus is only light and painting with light. I'm never ever think about clipped highlights or overexposure. In fact, I use it. So sometimes I really use a clipped highlight because I find it nice. I'll show you an example of where I did that. If we go back here, where I used the clipped highlight to my advantage, this one here. So here I have a clipped highlight. So I have it, this is typical where people would try to recover the shadow area here. I did quite a bit, but I never controlled this because I like this effect. I thought with the people standing, this particular lens is such an awesome lens for a 3D look. I thought, what a nice image, and I kept it, and I only highlighted some areas a little better than what the original was. So again, if we go back to here, I dropped the exposure just a little, but I'm not afraid to do that, because remember, when we drop the exposure in Workspace, I'm still linked to the exposure controller of the camera because I'm working with a TruePix processor, but I'm not adding any noise because the sensor, the data from the sensor is set. It was done in the camera. I'm just doing a final exposure adjustment in Workspace. And then the white balance, I would like to select a gray point, and I'm going to do it somewhere here. Let's just see what it does. Yes, I like this. I like this look. I was looking for this, and then it looked very much the same the late afternoon I did this picture. And the color space I obviously keep at RGB. And then I do something interesting. I'm going to select natural picture mode here. And the reason for that is I don't want much eye enhance to try and optimize the image. I want a basic color profile placed onto this photo here. I use my picture modes in almost every picture, and much more recently than in the past. I find it so exciting and interesting to use picture mode as part of my editing process. So in the past, I stayed fixed, eye enhance, always the low version. And then I realized, but I'm making a mistake. The picture modes are so interesting, and it comes also back to what I said in the previous video. Go and discover these Olympus cameras and Workspace. It's absolutely amazing to work with these cameras. So the gradation I'm going to leave as is. I don't want to up the shadows necessary. I want to keep this image look as it is. And then we're going to look at the tone curve. So we're now sort of moving onto the gamma curve here, the look and feel of the image. And I might add a slight S curve. Let's just see what it looks like. Very little, very little. I don't want to darken the shadows too much. I like that. And now I'm going to do the painting of light phase. And I'm normally doing it with the highlights, midtones, and shadows. So what I'm doing here, I want to up the midtones just a little bit. I want to have a little bit more here. I want to drop the highlight mainly for the sky here a little, maybe, but I don't want to kill the image. So one has to be so careful. If you pull this highlight down, you really kill the image. Let's take it another step down. And now the question is, should I up the shadows or should I darken the shadows? And have a look what happens here. If I darken the shadow, I really get a definite pattern here with the shadows, highlights, and midtones. So look at that. So if I darken the shadow, I really emphasize, look at that. Don't you think that's awesome? And to make it a little bit more, I would add even one step more midtones, and now you're getting close. I could say one more step. Now remember what's happening here. I'm not adjusting the highlights with a midtone. So this is staying constant, and I'm not changing the lows with a midtone slider. I can add a little bit more shadow. I want to emphasize this line here. It's not really changing, so I'm going to go back there. That will be my final setting there. You could try and get more in here, back and forth, play with that. And then clarity, I always use clarity, and in this case, I'm going to leave it as is. And then the noise filter, now with something like the EM13 or 2 or the OM1, you have the AI noise filter in Workspace. And same thing, I will select the low option here. And normally this will clean any noise that I didn't want, so it will be quite a nice clean image here. And then I'm going to do a sharpening. I need a sharpening here because of the aperture, and I always use about 1.4. It's difficult to get the right setting here. Let's use a 1.5, and this is the final image. So if you had to zoom in, so you can see this is not noise here. In fact, look at the window there. This is the wall, has this sort of pattern in it, but it's a very clean image. Like I said, you can see it in the window here. And there's lovely detail at f2.8, and I even have the benefit of the sky on the top here. Go and have fun with your Micro Four Third camera in low light photography. You'll be amazed at the results you can get if you know how to control the efficiency of your sensor. Have a nice day, guys. Until next time, Siegfried.